Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome to another episode of The Beer Enthusiast. This is episode 30, and we've got a very special one. This is Staggers and Jags Cold IPA from a brewery called Gold Dot, and they've kind of got an interesting story as to how they came about. So I'm gonna kick it over to Chris, and he's got all that information for us. So Chris, tell us a little bit about Gold Dot.
Yeah, so Gold Dot, being the kind of premium lager side project of Heater Allen at this point, has the person who coined the term Cold IPA. And a lot of people have brewed things in the past that are kind of akin to what Kevin Davey is trying to accomplish with Cold IPA. But if you're going to go to a source of where a lot of the technique and name converged, it's Kevin Davey from his tenure at Wayfinder Beer in Portland. And so he's moved on to brew with his partner at Heater Allen. And, Heater Allen is another just ginormous favorite of ours. And Cold IPA is kind of a unique style take that we haven't really covered before. So we wanted to go, this is kind of like the newest version of the original creator of Cold IPA. So that's
Yeah.
why we're here. And funny enough, you can't really, at least I couldn't, maybe folks' research powers are better than mine. I couldn't find a lot specific about the recipe for this Cold IPA, which is the only one that Gold Dot has released so far. But you can't swing a dead cat on the Cold IPA internets and not run into interviews with Kevin Davey.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Bunch of recipes, a bunch of interpretations. There's even a roundtable discussion on craft beer and brewing magazine podcast. And so his philosophy about it is extremely clear to me. So
Yeah.
I think that we can figure out 98% of what the recipe is, maybe with like one hop substitution or two. And even then, I think we would get pretty close. And so I wanted to take just a little bit of time to talk about Cold IPA more broadly. And Kevin likes to kind of describe it as the antithesis of hazy IPA. And while that might feel like a cheap shot at hazy IPA, he does like hazy IPA. And I think it's a useful heuristic to think about it, right? Because where hazy IPA de emphasizes bitterness, they've kind of brewed this style in Cold IPA that wants to bring back some of that like mid 2006 style, like real punchy bitterness. Crystal clear, sometimes, filtered, but at least, you can see right through this sucker. It's quite clear. And then um, trying to de-emphasize the ester character a little bit. And the way that they primarily do that is brew with a lager yeast. And so think
Yeah.
of these as kind of Pilsner-esque or even malt liquor-esque base profiles, hopped like an American IPA. And don't get too caught up on the name IPA and that it uses lager yeast. Think of it as something they have a bunch of like cheeky catchphrases about it. And, the one on this can says none colder, which I love. And then when they started brewing them at Wayfinder, they would say Wester than West Coast. And it was this
Hmm.
harkening back to basically as pale as you could get, as hoppy as you could get, as crisp and bitter as you could get. And it's all about the drinkability for them. They want you to reach for another Cold IPA after you had the first one, and kind of all the physical properties of this beer meant to create that. And one of the main not so secrets at this point is a pretty high use of adjuncts, most commonly rice, but you could use corn as well. And we're talking adjuncts in the old school, like macro brewing style sense, you know, either raw or flaked rice or corn. We're talking about different types of grain that you can use in your recipe build, not adjuncts like flavoring additions like pastry stouts or whatever it may be. Um, so typically cold IPA is like 20 to even 30% rice in the malt bill, and they like to use an American two-row Pilsner style malt, so like a super pale malt. And then Kevin talks a lot about in all the interviews He always incorporates kind of the C hops before Citra, right? He loves his Centennial,
Mm.
Chinook, a little bit of Columbus, Cascade, whatever it may be, to get some of that really punchy, piney character in there. And so, we'll get to drink and smell this beer and see if that shines through. But I would imagine that it contains some of those more classic C hops, and maybe something else as an accent hop. Um, we'll figure it out as we go along. But yeah, we're talking about um, the grain build of a malt liquor with the hopping of an IPA. And, you know, Scott might end up getting me going on, my interpretation between lager and ale, or if we even necessarily need one. But I like the naming convention. Some people might see it as kind of a marketing ploy, um, or we have too many types of IPA already. And I think the more that we can differentiate the styles, the better. We already have a million substyles of IPA that are kind of easy to recognize, red IPA, brown IPA, white IPA. Those seem a little bit easier, but how do you differentiate between the truly granular differences between, something that's a little bit drier, a little bit more crisp? Um, and I think the style of beer, if you're talking lager versus ale, is a little bit more about the outcome in this sense. And an important note is that they don't lager this beer. So to call it a lager kind of takes some of the process equation out of it. They don't lager it. And call me old school, but I think you have to lager a lager. So that's just my personal opinion.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, why don't we dive in? We'll kind of like go in and out of different parts of the cold IPA style using this as a template. But what are you getting on the nose?
Tons of like just classic like grapefruit peel. There's tons of like mandarin orange oils. There's a little bit of that kind of like dried, pine, resinousness that you get. Again, like you said, this is screaming a lot of West Coast old school. There's a little bit of like maybe dried mango chips. But yeah, kind of in the opposite vein of these overripe characteristics from some of these newer New Zealand hops, things that are extremely popular. Not a ton of these tropical fruits, but more of these citrus based fruits. They're dried or they're resinous or there's this sort of forest like character to them, and then just that really really crackery, again just getting this in almost this impression of just something that's dried, an oyster cracker, dried unsalted saltines, as opposed to the kind of bread dough kind of character that you get from, again, it's like you're seeing the antithesis of hazy, even in just the impression on the aroma.
Yeah, and I would like to even note that super old school IPAs that had a little bit of crystal malt in there tended to bend that pine and resin character towards that like sappy, sticky. And this isn't that to me. This is more like fresh pine, fresh forest, even some kind
Yeah.
of like white sage type characteristics, very like almost outdoorsy in the pine profile, and fresh smelling. And I agree with all the kind of citrus components that you laid out as well. Even kind of like a white grapefruit thing going on. It's very aromatic, and one thing that is interesting to test out right now is this can. We wanted to get to it a little bit earlier, but it's about 2 months old,
Mm.
and there's some scholarship and conventional wisdom that lager yeast lends to the shelf stability of beers a little bit better than ale yeast does. That primarily has to do with some of the sulfur compounds that lager yeast can kick out as kind of an antioxidant and preservative. And I haven't taken a sip yet. Scott's going to lead us into the sip in a moment, but on the aroma, it smells pretty darn good for 2 months in the can, I gotta say.
Right. I agree. Yeah, I would definitely agree with that.
Mm. Yeah, now we're launching into the flavor a little bit.
Wow.
Um, this
Yeah, this
is
is.
a lot of that rings true on the flavor. I would say the bitterness has maybe diminished a little bit in the time past, but it's still quite firm. Um, it doesn't quite harken back to
Yeah,
like
this is
ruination style bitterness that's just like bitterness for the purpose of being bitterness, but it is, where modern West Coast is using juicier and fruitier hop combinations, more tropical oriented. This does retain that like punchy grapefruit and fresh pine style bitterness, and it just kind of, I enjoy that 1-2 punch. And it doesn't need to be more complicated than that, but those are the main two notes I'm getting in the hop character.
yeah. I think this is a situation where there's that gripping bitterness that you're talking about that you get from like American strong ales like Arrogant Bastard, and I think this is kind of in a place where the perceived bitterness is just higher because again when you're working with lager yeast you're just going to get a little bit higher attenuation. They're going to be able to convert more complex sugars into alcohol and CO2, and so it's just going to be you're going to taste this and you're going to think, oh, maybe this is, and again we're speaking probably thinking this would maybe be a little bit more bitter if we were drinking it a little fresher, but you've just got to think that some of that elevation in perceived bitterness is really just the fact that it's probably just more highly attenuated and there's less residual sugar. And the reason that comes off to me is that the height of the perception is there, but it's not in that gripping way. It's almost in a way where you're wondering what are they doing with the water profile to make sure that the bitterness is quite perceivable but still soft in a sense.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I like the way you're talking about that because Kevin speaks multiple times about how those kind of older school mid 2000s hop bombs, they still had some sense of balance to them. There was no illusion that they weren't tilted dramatically toward the hop character, but it was a type of impactful and quality bitterness that um, you were left a little bit drier on the palate and wanting another sip. Right? It wasn't just destroying your palate in the most old school sense. There was, even if hard to find, some kind of balance there, and this really screams that to me because you wouldn't confuse this for being a less bitter beer, but you're not left bruised in any capacity on your palate, and you really do kind of want to keep going back in. And I think it's a good time to, there are a lot of beer styles that cross over into cold IPA, in and out of cold IPA. We've had IPL, India Pale Lager, before, and a couple of breweries are kind of holdouts on that. We've had Brute IPA, which I think shares a lot of affinity with cold IPA in terms of the dryness and the effervescence and some of that type of character. And so, where cold IPA sets itself apart, I think, is borrowing from the dryness of brewed IPA, harkening back to the bitterness of, old school kind of Southern California, San Diego style IPAs, your Ballast Point Sculpins, your Stone IPAs, those kind of things. Um, and then upending what we thought about IPL, which is we still want to stay in kind of IPA strength territory. This is 7.1%. But we're not going to use any like body impacting malts like Munich or Vienna. We want it to be super duper pale and svelte and crisp. And so it has kind of created its own thing. Yeah, it's borrowed from 3 or 4 different things, chief among them, in my opinion, old school West Coast IPA. But the drinking experience is very much IPA. I think if you handed this beer to 100 tasters of mixed beer education, they almost all would say this is some kind of West Coast IPA, and you'd have a
Yeah.
difficult time getting someone to uh, pull out that it's fermented with lager yeast, and most notably, it's fermented warm for lager yeast. We're talking the upper 50s at the lowest, and these lager yeast is very happy at 65 degrees, 62 degrees. You could even push it as high as 68. You get much higher than that, and you can have some other complications. But your note about lager yeast kind of being able to digest more complex sugars just kind of leaves us with this, ultra dry but not astringent, um, not astringent to the point of just like wicking all the moisture out of your mouth.
Hmm.
Extremely flavorful, aromatic IPA, and I like it.
Yeah, one thing you said, it brings it's a good transition into a question I was really hoping to ask you, and it's the example that you gave where there's 100 tasters and they probably couldn't tell you that this was, they would probably just think this is West Coast IPA or American IPA. And also speaking of the craft beer and brewing magazine podcast, there seem to be a lot more breweries that are going on there, and they're saying, we've actually just decided to move to lager yeast as just our house yeast, and we use it for everything. And they're using it in their IPAs. Firestone Walker, has come out and said that they're doing this. So I wanted to just we can just do I mean, this is something I think we could maybe parse out if we wanted this to be a much longer episode, but we'll keep it in the context of our studies for the Master Cicerone exam. Cicerone teaches to the BJCP guidelines. Chances that the next every probably 6 or 7 years there's an update to the guidelines, something
About,
in
yeah.
something in that range of time. Yeah, it seems to be relatively consistent. What do you think the chances are that let's just say it's the 2028 guidelines that American IPA says can be made with lager or ale yeast?
Oh, honestly, that version of a correction would be awesome in my opinion. Instead of
I agree. Thank you.
yeah,
Okay, good. Yeah,
instead of carving out a separate style, it's almost like a
yeah,
sub-style of American IPA, right? But all bets are off with the BJCP. I mean, they work. It's volunteer driven. It's a thankless task in a lot of ways. So I don't want to disparage it, but it is slow moving, which is why the guidelines change only every 5, 6, 7 years. And because it's slow moving, Brute IPA just got added to BJCP guidelines, and Brute
yeah.
IPA is basically extinct at this point.
Right.
For all intents and purposes, it's quite endangered at the very least. And so, yeah, maybe we can't foresee what the state of cold IPA is going to be in a few years when they redo. But with, like you said, breweries like Highland Park, Firestone Walker, breweries you don't even know about are just, they're ending their lager cycles with brewing an IPA. They're not going to reuse that yeast again. They'll just make an IPA and kind of call the generations of that yeast kaput at that point. And I think a lot of people are really liking how that extremely low ester character, just that pinch of sulfur, not eggy sulfur. We're talking like just a little bit of a matchstick kind of sulfur character, which, in my humble opinion, and I have no science to back this up, I think helps with some of those punchier hop aromatics that where you get a little bit passion fruity or a little bit like really really bright grapefruit, or gooseberry or something like that. And so yeah, some of the breweries aren't using it to define cold IPA. They're just making their next IPA with lager yeast, and so they might not be using the adjuncts. They might not be following kind of the hop bill ideas that Kevin Davey has, but they're cribbing one very important aspect, which is we're going to use a yeast that's going to ferment this sucker pretty dry, and that the yeast flavor and aroma is going to get out of the way for the most part, and this is going to be a showcase of hop aroma and flavor. And so, yeah,
Yeah.
if they make an update, they can, let's just put it the characteristics ingredients of American IPA. And we just add, if you're feeling spicy, do it with lager yeast. It's totally fine.
Yeah. I agree. All right, cool. Let's move into food pairing. One thing I am really curious about is what do you think are some of the differences that we need to take into consideration for pairing with this, and also in comparison to pairing with more of a more sort of traditional American IPA, if you think there are really any differences. And maybe you could just think, no, I mean, there's pretty much going to be a lot of crossover and it's just going to be very similar, or do you think there are any aspects that should really be taken into consideration in regards to comparing those two styles in the context of pairing?
I think we should be on the lookout for two main things, and one is the hop character in this is older school rather than new school. So where
Mm,
in some modern American IPA we might be looking to pair some of those stone fruit and passion fruit and guava and mango type characteristics to complement some other, whatever it is, soft dairy character or, something fruity in the food. We've got our classic grapefruit pine 1-2 punch with some supporting herbal and citrusy characteristics that are slightly outside of that scope. And so the complements are going to be a little bit different just on the hop flavor and aroma. And then you're robbed in one sense of almost any complexity in the malt bill. I mean, this beer, you'd be hard pressed to come up with 3 or 4 different malt notes to this beer. Like you said, it's kind of blank canvas. We're talking unsalted cracker, maybe a little bit of white bread, but it's not even like particularly doughy or chewy. Um, the rice is in there to lighten the color and the body of the beer. It's not. It does have flavor, but it's not. Uh, it's not an intense
yeah.
flavor. And so where sometimes you might be trying to pair smaller elements of crystal malts or like a pinch of Vienna malt or something a little bit chewier and robust in the malt character of a regular IPA, we don't have that tool here. So we can flex that to our advantage by pairing it with something that we wouldn't pair with an American IPA, or just, need to be careful of, maybe this malt character in this one is not going to bring out as much, deeply toasted bread character in something as another IPA might, for example.
Yeah. Yeah, the only those are great ones, and the only one that I would add is all the talk that we've had about higher levels of attenuation. That means when the more this you can't lean, potentially nearly as sweet, with maybe something that's a little bit more on the traditional side, because you are getting those higher attenuation levels. You are getting this again when it's a higher perceived bitterness. Like there are beers that where the bitterness has this kind of perception, but they've got a sort of more complex malt backbone to kind of back it up. Celebration from Sierra Nevada is a very, very clear example of that. Again, very and lots of very similar aspects to this beer. All the that's like old school before Citra, like C hop kind of stuff. Same kind of deal,
Mm-hmm.
but once you're like you said, once you get into the different malt profiles, it's the complexity of the malt, and then also any sort of both sweetness and any impression of sweetness that you might get from the beer. You're the balance beam is just even smaller when it comes to not just kind of falling over and having a little bit too much of a contrast, or just kind of being left over with just a little bit too much of a perception of bitterness or something like that. But so yeah, even for two styles that are very, very close, I mean, you just kind of change one thing on the dial, and it throws the whole balance out of whack in what you can be doing. But would you come up with something for the savory side of things?
Well, I immediately wanted something fatty, and I was thinking through um, different like avocado dishes, which I think would be really, really nice with this. Um, and some classic American IPA pairings are like burgers and with all manner of bacon and stuff like that on them. And I went full circle back to I was kind of like thinking of fried egg on a burger for a while, but then I just wanted to totally strip it down and simplify it, and I think this would be really good with deviled eggs. And because deviled eggs, you're removing the yolk. You got that fatty yolk. You're adding some mayo, a little bit of Dijon mustard, which gives you that kind of nasally spiciness that's not really capsaicin like
Mm-hmm.
spicy. And then making the filling for your little deviled egg and sprinkling some paprika on top is kind of the most traditional way to use it. And you can push and pull some little levers for inventive deviled eggs. But I think that um, that piney kind of resiny character is going to be really nice against the backdrop of that kind of like fatty, creamy, yolky character. I even thought about, and I probably would do this, make more of like a deviled egg style set egg salad sandwich. So egg salad sandwich has a lot of the same
Mm.
ingredients as deviled eggs, but let's just make the deviled eggs and then make it into an egg salad type filling for a sandwich, and use a pretty neutral bread. I'm not trying to reinvent the wheels, just like a really high quality white sandwich bread. Um, and Yeah, that like mildly peppery, spicy, woody paprika character with the pine, I think is going to be really, really exciting. Um, when we're talking about the fattiness of eggs and mayo, you got all the cutting power for days. Both the bitterness is really going to help there, but then these beers typically are carbonated on the higher end of the spectrum. They want them up near, you know, 2.5 volumes at the lowest, and probably if you could achieve it 2.8 on draft, really spritzy, kind of effervescent nature. And so that was my savory. I couldn't shake fattiness, and I came around to eggs, and then we're doing deviled eggs, but let's morph it into a deviled egg salad sandwich. And one of the things that you put in deviled eggs too in the filling, that I think is a really underrated component here, is a little bit of vinegar. You just bring in a little bit of
Mm.
acid into the fold. It's not tart when you eat a deviled egg or an egg salad sandwich, but it's a flavor amplifier. It's like that squeeze of
Mhm.
lemon, and I think that that's gonna hopefully bring out more of that lightly fruity, citrusy, grapefruity type character in the beer. So that's my savory. How about you?
Well, I'm glad you went with the sandwich because I was kind of back and forth. I had two that I was really playing with, but one of them was a sandwich, so I'm gonna eschew from that one, and I'll go with one of the dishes that I made. My spouse sends me recipes from Instagram all the time, and on the Super Bowl, I promised her that I would make one of the 20 that I've have not made yet. And one of them was a one thing I have tried with many iterations of IPA, from English IPA to American IPA to all sorts of things, is when it comes to a charcuterie board, prosciutto to me is a really excellent way to tone down the bitterness, and which then can amplify some of the hop character in my experience. And so I think going with a prosciutto wrapped camembert. So just kind of taking a wheel of camembert, cutting them into a slice that can kind of be rolled into a slice of prosciutto. Then choose your favorite kind of jam. Let's go with like a blueberry jam. We used a different jam for the Super Bowl recipe that I maybe wouldn't want to use for this one. I think we were doing cherry, but I'd rather go with blueberry. I've kind of honestly, for that, the first thing that comes to mind is like if there's any hop that's kind of like seems to play in two different worlds, in like the kind of new school hazy and old West Coast, it's Mosaic. And
Mm.
when you just get those Mosaic linalool levels at the right level, you get that real nice blueberry character that people always seem to be like it's the thing that brewers want, but it's ever elusive. And from my understanding and some of the reading I've done, it's just like the linalool just has to be at like the right concentration, or it can just change flavor on a dime. So to anybody out there who gets that from Mosaic, just count yourself as blessed, because it doesn't happen all that often. So a little bit of that blueberry just spread onto a puff, get a frozen puff pastry from the grocery store. Cut it into, usually those are kind of in like longer strips of four. Cut those four strips and then cut that in half. That should probably be big enough to kind of do. It's almost like a prosciutto wrapped, camembert in a blanket, kind of, if you kind of imagine it that way. And then just pop that sucker in the oven and then you're just basically cooking the puff pastry, and everything else will take care of itself. But for me, the big kind of thing that's going to bring a lot of balance and allow a lot more things to be cohesive is the salt from the prosciutto, doing a little bit of tempering in the bitterness. There's a puff pastry that any sort of malt character that's there can kind of latch onto it, maybe even increase some perception, adding a little bit of malt complexity. And then, of course, for hop character, I mean, cheese is just like, the other thing the sandwich I had mozzarella. Like those were gonna with this kind of hop character, like you want cheese, but I like the camembert because you're getting some of that grassiness, and so you're going to be
Yeah.
playing into those kinds of other characters. Obviously, the other one, I had the other sandwich had basil on it, so that was the way I was going to play into kind of that grassier kind of hop character, and also these kinds of fruits that are like this. Just wrapping those things in prosciutto on their own. Whether it's things like mango or pear or, and even to your point, I mean, in Italian cuisine, having something like that with a drizzle of balsamic, that's a pretty classic, Italian appetizer. So there's lots of synergies going on that could even lead to some interesting impressions of, classical dishes outside of, what either of these things are trying to accomplish, or, the roots that they come from. So that was my savory one. What did you come up with for dessert?
Yeah, I'm gonna continue the egg theme for my dessert, but I wanted to say too that Camembert has, with along with that grassy character, there's kind of like an ephemeral funkiness to it that is, I think, really going to pair with, a lot of people out of the older school hops get like a little bit of garlic or chive or like green
Mm,
onion type of character, and that's good. That would be awesome there if that's how you perceive Mosaic or Chinook or whatever it might be.
right.
That's going to be a really neat pairing with that particular dairy selection. Um, so sticking with eggs, souffle is where I want to go for dessert. And you can kind of, there are savory souffles, so there are a bunch of different like herbaceous souffles you could do with the savory. But for sweet, we obviously, in my opinion, we can't go chocolate. Chocolate souffle is very popular, but that's just going to be Clash City here for me. But there are,
Mm.
one of the most popular ways to have kind of a lighter, fruitier dessert souffle is to go with lemon, or with orange or orange liqueur.
Mm.
Lemon, I think, is really great here. So you've got, the egg that kind of creates, it doesn't really taste all that eggy, maybe as much as like a bread pudding might, or like a French toast. But it, helps create that lift and that oomph to a souffle. And you can dial down the sweetness a little bit because you don't want to go sweetness way too high. Lemon would create that kind of sweet and tart character, and hopefully help as like a kind of a fruit flavor enhancer to some of the grapefruit character that I'm getting from the hops. Um, or, while those two are more popular, lemon and orange or orange liqueur, um, I one that I've seen a couple of recipes for that I think is outside of the realm of a lot of traditional souffle, but I think would be super good would be strawberry. And so
Mm.
we have multiple times, and this is an ode to you in particular, but pairing strawberry with like the highly effervescent pale beers can create that like strawberries and champagne type character. And this isn't going to exactly mimic that. But there are so many kind of piney and herbaceous notes that it's almost like having strawberries muddled with a little bit of the strawberry greens. You know what I mean? So it's not unwelcome to have that herbaceous note in a strawberry dessert, like a strawberry ice cream with, some thyme or tarragon or something like that. And so strawberry souffle, I think, would be kind of an interesting middle zone where you're trying to create a little bit of that strawberries and champagne type character, but it's also got this even like new school cocktail type vibe of like muddled strawberries with strawberry greens. And but you're retaining that fluffy, eggy, fatty, lightly sweet base. And you still have all the carbonation and bitterness in the world to cut through that, but it's not going to be so great that's going to be an unpleasant experience, like just having a super bitter beer on the backdrop of something super sweet. So that's how I tried to thread the needle a little bit with keeping eggs in the equation. And souffle doesn't really taste like eggs, so it's a little bit irrelevant. But yeah, either lemon, orange liqueur, or strawberry souffle, I think is the route that I want to go. What say you?
Well, the first thing I say is I am so mad that I did not think of. Oh man, I'm so mad I did not think of strawberry, like any sort of strawberry thing with this, because that, yeah, it's like you said, like strawberry with just a strawberry with Duvel. People, like, you would just think that would just never work, but it's just like dropping a strawberry in your champagne. It's ridiculous. But I digress. What I kind of was working with here is there's an English dessert, and it's called a fool, just FOOL. It's traditionally made with kind of like a stewed and folded kind of pureed fruit. Traditionally, it's something like gooseberry, which is something that, again, you could, if you really wanted to, you could play it in something like this. But kind of like you said, let's kind of try and lean into into some of these more old school flavors. It's traditionally, again, kind of uses a sweet custard as a little bit of a base for that stewed fruit. But let's move that into just something, again, a little less sweet. Let's make that into just something like your just kind of like a base whipped cream. Again, something that's just going to be a great canvas for all of that hop character. Just think of anything, all of these kinds of fruits and flavors, just with a little bit of whipped cream, just to kind of like you said, just kind of cut into that really fresh, forest like, even dried, like just kind of giving it this kind of extra life, getting a little bit of a contrast that maybe won't be too much of a clash. This kind of dry, this dry cold IPA with something with a really fluffy, really dense kind of whipped cream, kind of a little bit of a textural contrast on the palate. But the thing that really kind of brought this, and for the fruit, again, we can work with what we want. You can go the blueberry route. I think it'd be really fun if you did raspberry for something like this. But one of the ingredients they suggested that really for me brought this home is just adding a little bit of like a rose water flavor to it, tying
Ooh.
in the sea hop character. Chinook, very very famous for having a little bit of like a red rose petal, very floral things like that, and I believe Cascade are just very high in geraniol, which really there's a lot of information out there, but it seems to be that the consensus for geraniol is it just smells like roses.
Mm-hmm.
And so not getting a lot of that here, I think, thankfully, because then it's just going to add to that impression of like, yeah, this is just old school sea hops. Again, hopefully, again, just the line that we're both just trying to teeter is that bitterness and sweetness. And so hopefully there's just enough there from the fruit, especially something like raspberry that's not too sweet, has a little bit of that, acidity, can play a little bit, kind of like just having a, kind of one of these like really juicy and bright red fruits and a champagne kind of impression. This, I don't know. Did we just bring cold IPA to brunch? Is this what we've just kind of determined? You're just talking eggs and we're just talking
Yeah.
champagne. I mean, I feel like we kind of backdoored into cold IPA as the new brunch beer.
Well, and we usually front door into brunch,
Yeah.
so you know.
Yeah, that's so true.
Yeah, so it
Oh, that's
does
so
not
true.
surprise me. I also kind of like raspberry as an idea too. With you get like a really seedy raspberry, and those seeds are like tannic,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
the hop expression in this is like hop tea, tannic, black tea type of, or like a pine needle type of tea character. It's not tannic and like all the moisture is whipped away, but in the same way that I wanted to kind of create that strawberries and strawberry greens or strawberry and herb profile, raspberry and raspberry seed or raspberry and herb kind of, I think, is a really thoughtful marriage as well. So I like that a lot. I think that that's a great idea. IPA and dessert is tough, and so finding where you can bounce those more unique savory profiles off of the sweet is most of the name of the game.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Oh, I think that's like a pretty delicious spot to leave it. Um,
Yeah. Absolutely.
we tend to wax poetically a little bit, and we've done so for several minutes now, and we could do five more episodes on cold IPA by itself. So, but this has helped us kind of situate some of the flavor characters in our mind. Hopefully, yours as well. Please like seek out your local breweries if you're not anywhere near Portland or McMinnville, Oregon. There are a lot of people following the cold IPA train, and you can buy those and kind of figure out for yourself whether either A, they're comporting to the views of the originator, or B, you even like it or not. That's up to each individual person. And so, but yeah, support the breweries in particular trying to branch out and create something in a really popular sub style that not a lot of people are doing. But I do think that the ideas behind cold IPA, even if cold IPA itself does not have as much staying power, the ideas definitely do. And so, yeah, snag your nearest cold IPA. I don't think we're 100% sure what our next episode is going to be, so stay tuned. We really want to do Obsidian Stout. We've been talking about that for a while. It's a little bit harder to get in our area these days. So if you have Obsidian Stout near you or a really good American Stout, keep that in your fridge to drink with us at some point. But we're gonna kind of refill the ledger on beers and get a little bit better schedule going out. But in the meantime, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel. Any questions or concerns or complaints that you have, please comment. We'd love to see that kind of stuff, particularly as it relates to the food and all of those things. And so we enjoy these episodes every week. We enjoy the most interaction that we could possibly get out of some of these things. And so please do. And, until then, also seek out Gold Dot because you deserve a Gold Dot.
That's right. Cheers, everybody.